The first breath of spring clung to the air like a fragile promise, trembling on the lips of dawn. The train had slowed with a screech of iron and a hissing cloud of steam, its black frame gleaming beneath the soft wash of sunlight. The little station seemed too small to hold such sound and smoke, too fragile to contain the weight of futures changing on its worn wooden planks. Crows lifted from the roof at the whistle's cry, their wings scattering dark against the pale morning sky. Among the disembarking passengers, she stepped down. Jeanne. 20 years old, slight of form but steady in her bearing. Her shoes touched the earth of a land she had never known, soil that felt both hostile and holy beneath her. A faded ribbon of silk, the color of seafoam, held back her dark hair, its threads frayed from her long passage. In her hands she carried a small trunk, scratched by travel and heavy with the little she could call her own. The crowd looked at her not as one sees another soul, but as if she were an interruption in their story. A hush lingered when she passed, eyes following, whispers curling like smoke in her wake. She had not been meant for this. Another had been chosen, her sister, May, the elder, stronger, more accustomed to hardship. But the decision had been made behind closed doors, at the table of her family, beneath lantern light and a silence she could not break. When the contract was written, when the letter sent across oceans, it was not her name but May's. Yet when the day arrived, it was Jeanne who was dressed in travel clothes, Jeanne who was pressed into her mother's arms one last time. May had fallen ill, and the family, weighed by debt and pressed by shame, had no choice. Jeanne would go. Jeanne would bear it. So now she stood, the substitute bride, waiting with her chest tight, searching for the man who would claim or cast her aside. He was not hard to find. Jacob Murphy, 27, stood taller than most, his frame broad from years of work under sun and rain. His coat was plain, his boots scarred with use, his hat tipped against the morning light. But it was not his size that drew attention. It was the stillness about him, the way he stood rooted as if the world's noise washed past without stirring him. His eyes were not sharp, not cruel, but quiet, carrying the color of deep river water. The station master, a stout man with sweat at his collar, came forward with his ledger. His voice rang out above the murmurs, calling for the bride expected. All turned, waiting to see the union promised by paper and paid by coin. And when Jeanne stepped forward, a hush spread wider. The man who had sent for a bride, a merchant with quick hands and greedy eyes, looked upon her with a curl of disdain. This was not the woman he had bargained for. This girl, fragile, foreign, was not the sister promised. He muttered, spat to the ground, and turned away, abandoning her before the crowd, as though she were a parcel misdelivered. The silence that followed was worse than laughter. She felt it like cold iron against her chest. She lowered her gaze, clutching the trunk close, her heart pounding. Alone, unwanted, in a land where even the air seemed strange. It was then Jacob stepped forward. He did not speak quickly. He did not call attention. He simply reached down and took hold of the trunk she struggled to bear. His hands were rough, his movements steady, as though it were the most natural act in the world. He did not ask her name, for it had already been spoken in whispers. He did not question why her sister had not come. He only lifted the weight from her arms and walked beside her, leaving the station behind. The crowd parted for him, not with kindness, but with wary curiosity. Some muttered that Jacob Murphy had lost his mind. Some wondered if pity had blinded him. But he heard nothing of it, or if he did, he gave no sign. They reached the edge of town, where the spring fields stretched out in green hush, tender shoots breaking through the thawed earth. The road ahead was rutted, soft with mud. Birds sang unseen in the budding branches. Here, away from the eyes of the town, Jacob paused. He set down the trunk, his gaze steady on the horizon, then at last turned toward her. His voice, when it came, was low, even. Not harsh, not tender, but honest. He told her there was room at his ranch, if she wished it. He did not call it charity. He did not call it duty. Only room. A roof. Food. Quiet. His mother, aged and weary, could use the help of another pair of hands. That was all he offered. Jeanne bowed her head, unable to meet his eyes for long. Her heart was caught between gratitude and shame. She had been sent as a bride and had become instead a burden carried by a stranger. She whispered assent, her words soft, nearly lost to the wind. They walked on. The field stretched wide, the earth damp with spring's renewal. A hawk wheeled above, its shadow gliding over them. Each step forward felt uncertain, yet steadier than the last. By the time the cabin came into sight, small against the sweep of land, smoke rising thin from its chimney, the sun was higher, washing the world in pale gold. Jeanne's heart tightened at the sight. This was no palace, no grand house. Yet it was real, solid, rooted in soil and labor. At the doorway stood Ellen Murphy, Jacob's mother. Her frame was bent, her hair silvered, her eyes sharp with both fatigue and kindness. She saw the girl beside her son, saw the trunk, saw the way Jeanne kept her eyes lowered. For a long moment she said nothing, only studying her. Then, with a nod, she stepped aside, bidding them enter. The interior smelled of wood smoke and bread, the kind of warmth that clung to walls built by hand. Jeanne set her shoes aside, stepping lightly across the floor. She felt the weight of the journey at last begin to settle, exhaustion tugging at her bones. Yet she stood upright, unwilling to show weakness before these strangers who had taken her in. Ellen guided her to the table, poured her water, pressed bread into her hands. Jacob placed her trunk near the wall, then busied himself with chores outside, leaving space for the women. For the first time, Jeanne felt tears press against her lashes. She blinked them back, swallowing hard. She was far from home, far from the sister whose place she had taken. She bore the burden of another's promise, and yet here she was, seated at a table, breaking bread, the warmth of kindness brushing against her like the first thaw of spring. Night fell softly that first day, the sky deep with stars. Jeanne lay in a small room, her trunk by her bed, listening to the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind across the prairie. She thought of May, of the path meant for another. She thought of the man who had turned his back on her. And she thought, though she would not yet admit it, of the man who had not. Jacob sat outside beneath the stars, his hat tipped low, the glow of his pipe fading and brightening with each breath. He did not know yet what it meant, this choice to step forward when others stepped back. He only knew he could not watch another cast aside. His silence was not emptiness, but a steady current, carrying both of them into waters yet unknown. And so the season opened. Spring's first blossoms pushed through the soil, tender yet unyielding. A girl cast out had found a roof not promised, a place not yet named, beside a man who carried burdens without words. The air smelled of renewal, but also of trials yet to come. For though the prairie stretched wide and welcoming, the whispers of the town lingered like shadows. Jeanne, lying awake with her hand pressed over her heart, felt it then. This was not the end of rejection, but the beginning of something harder, something that would demand both her strength and his. And though she could not name it, she sensed that the choice Jacob made at the station was not the last choice he would have to make. The night deepened, the stars wheeled slowly above, and the world waited. The days after her arrival unfolded like pages half wet with spring rain, each one fragile, each one carrying its own weight of silence. Jeanne moved quietly through the Murphy cabin, her steps careful upon the wooden planks, her hands steady as she took to the work offered her. She rose early, before the rooster crowed, and set about tending the fire, sweeping ash, fetching water. These were tasks she had done since childhood, though here the air was different, heavier with prairie dust and wood smoke, and every sound carried farther, echoing into a loneliness she did not yet know how to name. Jacob never told her what to do. He only gestured, pointed toward the woodpile, the worn broom, the pail beside the door. His words were few, his tone steady. She learned by watching him, by catching the rhythm of his days. He left before dawn to see to the animals, his boots sinking into the thawing earth, and returned with mud streaked up his trousers, his shirt damp with sweat. He did not boast of his labor, nor complain. He simply moved, as though every motion was a prayer to the land itself. Ellen, his mother, watched Jeanne with eyes that had known too many seasons, sharp yet softened by the gentleness that comes when one has seen grief and chosen not to grow bitter. Her hair was pulled back in a neat knot, her hands gnarled from years of kneading dough and pulling thread. She let Jeanne take up her share of the work, and when Jeanne faltered, Ellen guided her with a touch on the wrist, a nod, a small word in her weathered voice. The cabin soon filled with signs of Jeanne's presence. Cloths folded more carefully, floors swept more often, a faint trace of jasmine when she rinsed her hair in the evenings. Yet she never moved with the boldness of one claiming space. She bent her head when others spoke, her eyes lowered at the mercantile, her hands tucked in front of her when neighbors came. It was on one such day that Samuel appeared, leaning against the fence rail as Jacob led the horses back to pasture. Samuel was a man of 30, broad in the shoulders but quick with his mouth, the kind who filled silence with laughter not born of joy but of mockery. He tipped his hat, his smile carrying no warmth. "Quite the helper you've brought home," he remarked, loud enough for Jeanne to hear as she hung linens on the line. "Though I reckon folks'll wonder what you see in a girl like that." Jacob said nothing, only set his jaw and continued with the horses. His silence was heavier than words, but Samuel pressed on, his laughter carrying across the yard. Jeanne felt heat rise to her cheeks, her fingers trembling against the clothespins. She turned her face away, but the sting of shame had already sunk deep. That evening, at supper, Ellen reached for Jeanne's hand, her old fingers rough against the girl's smooth skin. "Pay no mind to fools," she murmured, her voice like wind through tall grass. "Kindness will always outlast their noise." Jeanne nodded, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She ate slowly, chewing bread that turned dry in her mouth, and wondered how long a kindness could endure when the whole town seemed bent on seeing her as less than human. The days grew longer, the light stretching into evenings painted with the tender glow of spring. Jacob and Jeanne worked side by side in the fields, planting seeds into the damp soil. The earth was cool beneath her fingers, the smell of it rich, carrying both promise and ache. Jacob moved steadily, row by row, his presence quiet yet grounding. Sometimes he offered her a tin cup of water without words, his hand brushing hers only for an instant, but enough to leave her heart fluttering as though startled by a bird's wing. At night, after chores were done, Jeanne sat by the lamplight, mending shirts with needle and thread. Jacob's sleeves were worn thin at the elbows, his collar frayed, and she stitched them with care, her hands precise, her thoughts restless. She wondered if he noticed, or if he saw her efforts as nothing more than the expected duties of a woman under his roof. Yet when he wore the mended shirt the next day without comment, she felt a small bloom of pride all the same. The town did not soften. At the mercantile, women turned their shoulders, speaking in low voices that carried just enough for Jeanne to hear. Children peered at her as though she were a curiosity, their mothers pulling them away with firm hands. Once, when she reached for a sack of flour, another hand snatched it first, the woman smiling coldly as she placed it in her basket. Jeanne's throat tightened, her chest heavy, but she said nothing. She only lowered her gaze and moved on, carrying her small bundle close. It was Jacob who lifted the burden without lifting his voice. He stood beside her in the store, his tall frame casting a shadow that left no room for cruelty to slip through. He carried her purchases without being asked, his steady steps beside hers a silent shield. He never spoke against the whispers, but his presence itself seemed to speak louder. "This woman walks with me." In the evenings, Ellen sometimes told stories by the fire, her voice weaving through the crackle of flames. Tales of her youth, of winters that bit hard, of summers that scorched the earth. She spoke not as one who sought sympathy, but as one who had endured and still found light. Jeanne listened closely, her head tilted, the lamplight soft on her face. She felt threads of belonging in those stories, as though Ellen's memories made space for her own. One night, after Jacob had retired, Ellen reached across the table, her eyes intent. "My son has carried silence for too long," she said softly. "He lost his father young. Learned to keep his words close, to bear his grief without spilling it. But silence can starve a soul if it is never broken. Don't let his quiet fool you, child. He sees more than he speaks." Jeanne lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening on the edge of her apron. She did not know what to answer. Part of her feared she had only been tolerated, a burden taken in out of duty. Yet another part, quiet but insistent, wondered if Ellen spoke truth, that Jacob's silence might hold not rejection, but recognition. The next day brought wind across the fields, carrying with it the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard near the river. Jacob and Jeanne worked mending the fence that had sagged from winter's weight. Her hands slipped, a splinter driving deep into her palm. She gasped, dropping the tool, pain sharp and sudden. Jacob was beside her before she could think, his rough hands cradling hers with unexpected care. He eased the splinter free, his fingers steady, his brow furrowed in concentration. When it was done, he wrapped her palm with a strip of cloth torn from his own sleeve, the warmth of his hand lingering as he tied the knot. Their eyes met then, for longer than either had dared before. His gaze held no pity, only steadiness, a depth that unsettled her more than any cruelty could. She pulled her hand back gently, her heart beating too quickly, her breath uneven. That night, lying in bed, she pressed her wrapped hand against her chest. The pain was little, but the memory of his touch would not leave her. As spring deepened, storms rolled across the land, dark clouds gathering in sudden bursts. One evening, rain lashed against the windows, the roof leaking where shingles had loosened. Jacob and Jean moved together, hauling buckets, shifting the animals, working side by side through the storm's fury. The wind howled, the rain drenched them both, but neither faltered. In the lantern light, as water dripped from her hair and his shirt clung heavy to his frame, she felt a strange sense of belonging. This was not her burden alone. It was theirs, shared. When the storm at last broke and quiet returned, they stood at the threshold, breathless, their shoulders brushing. Dawn was breaking, faint light spreading across the wet fields, and for the first time Jeanne allowed herself to wonder. Perhaps she had not been brought here only as a replacement. Perhaps her story was not one borrowed from her sister, but one she was meant to live. Yet the whispers in town did not cease. Samuel's words grew sharper, his laughter louder. Ellen's strength waned, her cough deepening. Jacob's silence held, steady but unreadable. Jeanne found herself caught between gratitude and doubt, between belonging and the ache of still being other. The blossoms along the river swelled with promise, the fields greening under Jacob's care, and the cabin held warmth against the world's chill. But in her heart lingered a question, heavy and unspoken. Was she truly chosen, or only endured? The answer waited, trembling like thunder on the horizon, unseen but certain. Spring thickened its colors, the prairie swelling green beneath a sky that carried both warmth and warning. The apple orchard by the river had begun to bloom, pale blossoms trembling against each breath of wind. Jeanne moved among them sometimes, basket in hand, gathering herbs and tender shoots, her eyes drinking in the fragile beauty. Yet even among blossoms, thorns find their way, and the sweetness of spring carried shadows not easily shaken. Jacob worked long hours in the fields, his broad frame bent to the plow, his silence steady as the land itself. Jeanne found herself drawn to his rhythm, not for the work alone but for the quiet strength it revealed. She brought him water, carried seed, mended fences with hands calloused for more than needle and thread. When she faltered, he was there without rebuke, lifting the weight, steadying her hand. Each day their gestures stitched closer together, though neither dared name it aloud. Still, the world beyond the cabin did not soften. At the mercantile, whispers had sharpened into words no longer hushed. Samuel, ever loud, ever eager for cruelty, leaned against the counter one afternoon as Jeanne waited with her list. His eyes swept over her, his smile thin as a blade. "Funny sight, ain't it?" he drawled to the men gathered near. Jacob Murphy, a fine rancher, choosing scraps the town's merchants won't even claim. Laughter rippled, rough and cutting. Jeanne felt the sting burn her cheeks, her breath catching. She clutched her basket tighter, her fingers whitening against the handle. She did not answer, but her silence seemed to feed their scorn. It was Jacob's shadow that silenced the laughter. He stepped forward, his presence alone enough to quiet the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He only set his coins upon the counter with a firmness that left no doubt, and then carried Jeanne's basket himself as they left. But though the store grew silent, the damage lingered like a wound left open. That night, Jeanne stitched by lamplight, the needle trembling in her hand. Jacob sat across from her, carving a small piece of wood into shape, his silence as steady as always. At last she spoke, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. "They do not want me here." Jacob looked up, his eyes catching the light. He did not answer at once, but his gaze held hers, steady, unflinching. At length he said only, "I do." The words were simple, no more than 3, but they settled in her chest like the first true warmth after winter. She lowered her head, unable to hide the tears that threatened, and stitched on in silence, each thread carrying something heavier than fabric. Days blurred into weeks. Together they tended lambs born too early, feeding them from bottles, cradling their fragile frames by the fire. Together they planted corn, row after row, the soil rich beneath their hands. And together they endured the town's judgment, Jacob by her side in wordless defiance. Yet Jen's heart remained restless. She could not help but wonder if Jacob's care was born of duty, of kindness alone, or if he saw her as something more. At night she lay awake, listening to the creak of timbers, the sigh of prairie wind, asking questions the dark could not answer. One afternoon, while gathering herbs near the orchard, she cut her palm upon a thorn hidden among blossoms. Blood welled bright against her skin, startling in its suddenness. Jacob was beside her in moments, his rough hands wrapping hers with cloth torn from his own shirt. His touch was gentle, his brow furrowed, his voice low as he told her to hold steady. She watched his face, the quiet concentration, the way his thumb lingered a fraction too long against her wrist. Something unspoken pulsed between them, raw as the wound itself. Ellen saw it too. That evening, as Jacob worked outside, she drew Jen close, her voice weakened by the cough that had grown harsher with spring's damp air. "My son carries his heart like stone," she whispered, her breath uneven. "But stone can crack, child. And when it does, what lies inside is truer than what men who boast can ever offer." Jean held her hand, fear and hope tangling in her chest. She wanted to believe, yet the echoes of scorn in town still rang too loudly. The turning came with the storm. Dark clouds gathered at dusk, thunder rolling like drums across the prairie. Rain fell hard, wind driving it sideways, rattling the windows. The roof leaked, buckets placed hastily beneath the drips. Jacob and Jean moved together through the fury, hauling animals to shelter, straining against the wind that threatened to tear the doors from their hinges. Her hair clung wet to her face, his shirt plastered to his skin, yet their movements carried one rhythm, one determination. At the height of the storm, a beam loosened in the barn, crashing down with a roar. Jean cried out, reaching to pull a lamb clear. Jacob was there in an instant, his arms shielding her, his strength holding against the weight. Rain and fear and exertion tangled together, but they emerged unbroken, the animals saved, the barn still standing. When at last the storm passed, dawn breaking pale across the soaked earth, they stood together at the threshold. Their shoulders brushed, their breaths mingled, the silence between them heavy with what neither dared speak. Jeanne turned her face toward him, searching, but Jacob's eyes held steady, unreadable yet burning with something deeper than words. The days that followed carried a new closeness, though still unspoken. He left small signs, a fresh stack of wood by her door, tools mended without her asking, a wildflower set in a jar upon the table. She, in turn, stitched his shirts with care, left bowls of broth when his labor left him weary, brushed dust from his hat when he laid it aside. It was not yet love declared, but love lived, quiet and steadfast. Yet Samuel's cruelty did not fade. One evening at the saloon, his voice rose above the din, mocking Jacob for wasting himself on a girl cast off like old cloth. The words traveled fast, carried on tongues eager for scorn. By the time they reached the cabin, Jeanne felt them like stones thrown against her skin. She wondered if Jacob, too, carried doubt, if his silence was not loyalty but reluctance. That night she lay awake, listening to the coughs from Ellen's room, the sigh of wind against the walls, Jacob's steady footsteps outside as he checked the fences. She pressed her hand against her chest, torn between gratitude for his care and fear of never being truly wanted. The orchard blossomed fully, petals falling like snow against the grass. Jeanne walked there one morning, her fingers brushing the blooms, her heart aching. She thought of her sister, of the life meant for another, of the cruel laughter in town. And she thought of Jacob's hand wrapping hers, of his words at the fire, "I do." She closed her eyes, the scent of blossoms thick around her, and whispered to herself that perhaps blossoms could thrive even among thorns. Yet when she opened them, she saw Samuel leaning against a tree, his smirk sharp as ever. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low, meant only for her ears. "He won't keep you forever. Men like him don't claim what others despise." Her breath caught, her heart pounding. She turned away, walking back toward the cabin, but his words clung like burrs, impossible to shake. At supper that evening, Jacob noticed her silence, the way her hands trembled against the spoon. He asked nothing, yet his gaze lingered as though he knew. Ellen coughed softly, her eyes filled with concern, but said nothing. The fire crackled, the room heavy with words unspoken. When night fell, Jacob stepped outside, the stars cold and sharp above. Jeanne followed, her steps hesitant, her shawl pulled close. He turned, surprised, and for a long moment they stood in silence, the night air thick with all that had been left unsaid. At last she spoke, her voice trembling. "Am I only endured here? Or am I seen?" Jacob's jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. He did not answer quickly, as if searching for words not easily given. The silence stretched, heavier with each heartbeat, until it seemed the night itself held its breath. And then, just as his lips parted, Ellen's cough rang out from within the cabin, sharp and ragged, pulling them both back. Jeanne turned toward the door, fear flashing in her eyes, and Jacob followed. The question hung in the air, unanswered, trembling like a blossom shaken loose by wind, waiting for the ground where it might fall. The spring sun rose with a strange gentleness the morning Ellen slipped away. The air was soft, full of bird call and the smell of damp earth, yet within the cabin the world grew still. Jeanne had woken early to fetch water when she heard the quiet rasp of breath falter, break, and vanish like a candle's flame. She rushed to the bedside, her heart pounding, but Ellen's eyes had already turned toward a place neither daughter nor son could follow. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then, as though sensing the tremor of her sorrow, Ellen's lips curved faintly, whispering words that brushed like feather against Jeanne's heart. "You are not alone." Jeanne held her hand long after the warmth faded, her tears falling soundless, soaking into the old woman's sleeve. Jacob stood in the doorway, his shoulders heavy with grief but his eyes steady, fixed upon his mother's still form. He did not weep openly. He bowed his head, removed his hat, and let the silence hold what words could never carry. Together they kept vigil until the sun tilted high, the prairie outside singing with life while death lingered within. The burial was quiet, only a few neighbors gathering out of duty more than love. They stood awkwardly at the edge of the small plot by the orchard, their gazes flickering to Jeanne with curiosity edged in disdain. She knelt beside the mound, smoothing earth with careful hands, whispering prayers in a tongue foreign to their ears. The blossoms fell around her like snow, a soft shroud of farewell. Jacob drove the final stake into the soil, marking the grave, his silence heavier than stone. Afterward, Samuel lingered as the others departed, his voice slick with false sympathy. "A hard loss," he said, his eyes sliding toward Jeanne. "But perhaps a chance for clearer choices now. Jacob, a man can't carry both grief and burden forever." His meaning was sharp as a thorn. Jeanne stiffened, her breath catching, but Jacob turned away without answer, leading her back toward the cabin. The orchard wind carried Samuel's laughter after them, cruel and lingering. The days following Ellen's death sank heavy with sorrow. Jeanne worked harder, cooking, mending, tending animals with a determination that left her body aching. She feared if she stopped, grief would consume her, leaving nothing behind. Jacob moved through his tasks with even greater silence, his jaw set, his eyes shadowed. At night, Jeanne sometimes heard the floorboards creak as he paced, unable to find rest. It was then Samuel came again, pressing his cruelty more boldly. He found Jeanne near the well one afternoon, her hands raw from scrubbing linens. He leaned against the post, his smile sharp. "You think he'll keep you? You're only here because his mother needed help. Now she's gone. Men like Jacob don't bind themselves to scraps the town despises." Jeanne froze, her chest tight. She turned away, refusing to answer, but his words lodged deep. That night she lay awake, tears burning her eyes, unable to silence the fear that had long lingered in the corners of her heart. She was tolerated, perhaps even pitied, but never truly wanted. The next morning, she began to pack. Quietly, carefully, folding her few dresses, tucking her ribbon into the small trunk that had carried her across the sea. She could not bear to stay where whispers poisoned every kindness, where her presence cast shadows upon Jacob's name. Better to leave before rejection came from his lips, better to disappear like snow melting beneath spring sun. But Jacob noticed. He found her at the door, the trunk at her side, her eyes lowered to the floorboards. His voice was steady, though his breath carried weight. "Where are you going?" She faltered, clutching the handle tighter. "I should not bring you more shame. They say you will send me away. Perhaps it is best if I go now." His silence stretched long, the air between them trembling. Then his eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he stepped closer. "Who told you that?" She could not answer. Her throat closed, her heart pounding. The truth would only bring more strife, and she feared to speak Samuel's name. She lowered her gaze, tears threatening to fall. "It does not matter. I was never meant to be here." He stared at her, his chest rising and falling as though holding back a storm. Then, without another word, he turned and strode from the cabin, leaving the door swinging wide behind him. The sky darkened that afternoon, clouds rolling heavy, rain beginning to fall. Jeanne hitched her trunk onto the wagon, her hands trembling, her breath uneven. She climbed onto the seat, her heart aching with each creak of the wheels. As the rain thickened, blurring the world, she urged the horse forward, tears mingling with the downpour. But before the wagon reached the bend in the road, hooves thundered behind her. Jacob rode hard, rain streaming down his coat, his hat pressed low against the storm. He caught up, reining his horse before the wagon, blocking the path. She gasped, pulling the reins tight, the wheels jolting to a halt. He dismounted swiftly, striding toward her, his hair plastered to his brow, his eyes burning with a fire she had never seen. "You don't leave," he said, his voice cutting through the rain. "Not now. Not ever." Jeanne's breath broke, her hands trembling against the reins. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why keep me when they despise me? Why carry what others call shame?" He stepped closer, the storm raging around them, his voice steady though his chest heaved. "Because I chose you. From the first day, when they turned their backs, I chose you. Not out of pity, not out of duty, but because you are the one I see, the one I want beside me." The rain beat harder, drenching them both, but neither moved. Jeanne stared at him, her heart pounding, her tears mingling with the storm. His words struck deep, breaking through the fear that had bound her for so long. She felt her chest ache with something fierce and tender all at once. Slowly, Jacob removed his hat, heavy with rain, and placed it upon her head. The brim sagged with water, yet the gesture carried more weight than vows spoken in church. It was a silent promise, a claim before the world, that she belonged with him. Jeanne's breath caught, her hands trembling as she reached for him. His arms closed around her, pulling her against him, the storm wrapping them in its fury. For the first time, she let her tears fall freely, not of sorrow but of release, of finding a place where she was no longer unseen. They returned together, wagon following the horse, rain easing as the storm passed. The town watched from porches and windows, whispers rising, but Jacob did not falter. He walked beside her, his arms steady around her shoulders, his gaze forward. Jeanne held her head higher than before, the brim of his hat shielding her from scorn. Days later, when the preacher spoke the vows beneath the budding orchard, blossoms falling like blessings upon them, the town gathered in uneasy silence. Some whispered still, but none dared voice scorn against the man who stood so steady. And when Jacob's hand closed over hers, when his voice spoke words plain but true, Jeanne felt the last of her fear dissolve. She was not borrowed, not endured. She was chosen, forever. The cabin grew warm again with laughter and labor, though Ellen's absence lingered like a soft echo. Jeanne planted flowers by her grave, blossoms bright against the soil, a promise that love outlasts grief. Jacob worked beside her, his silence no longer heavy but full, carrying the weight of a bond that needed no ornament. And when the evenings came, they sat together by the fire, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting with quiet certainty. The prairie outside stretched wide, filled with both hardship and beauty, but within the walls of that small cabin there was something stronger than both, a belonging hard one, a love not given by chance but chosen by will. The seasons would change. Storms would come again. The town would whisper still. But blossoms had rooted deep among the thorns, and no hand could tear them free. For in the end, the truth of it was simple. A man who had carried silence, and a girl cast aside, had found in each other the one thing the world could never strip away. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls. Jacob's hand closed gently over hers, and in that quiet, she knew at last, she was no one's replacement. She was his, and he, hers. And though the night pressed close against the cabin windows, the future stretched wide as the prairie, waiting.